Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at an interesting connection, the kind of surprising link between pain and pleasure.
Yeah.
And to help us with this, we've got some pretty fascinating source material that explores how seeking out discomfort can actually lead to like greater feelings of well-being.
Well, wild, right?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting concept. Like this whole idea that the things we typically try to avoid could actually be like the secret to feeling better, you know?
Exactly. And to kick things off, we're going to start by talking about this guy, Michael.
Okay.
Now, Michael he's kind of a classic Silicon Valley success story, right? On the surface, he's got it all. But behind that facade, he was struggling with addiction.
Yeah. You know, it's a good reminder that outward appearances can be super deceiving.
Hmm.
And for Michael, things actually took like a really interesting turn after he quit drugs and alcohol.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. He found himself kind of wrestling with all these like raw, unfiltered emotions and really needed to find a way to cope.
So what did he do? Well, that's where cold showers come in.
Cold showers.
Yeah. It started, well, it was almost by accident. A tennis coach randomly suggested a cold shower after this particularly intense session. And Michael, I mean, he was desperate for any kind of relief, right? So he's like, okay, what have I got to lose?
Sure.
So he gave it a try. And while that first blast of cold water wasn't exactly enjoyable, he noticed something pretty amazing afterward.
What was that?
Like a shift in his mood. It was like hitting a mental reset button, you know?
It's wild how something so simple can have such a profound impact, right?
It is. And this really piqued his curiosity.
Of course.
So he started looking into researching the effects of cold water immersion and started gradually upping his exposure to it. I mean, he went from cold showers to ice baths and then even eventually started sleeping on a cold water mattress.
Whoa, hold on. A cold water mattress?
Yeah, seriously.
Wow, that's dedication.
It is. But here's the thing that really caught his attention was this pattern he observed. The more intense the initial discomfort, the bigger, the more intense the feeling of euphoria and well-being he felt afterward. It was like he was purposely pressing on the pain side to unlock this surge of pleasure on the other end.
Okay, now that sounds pretty counterintuitive, right? But is there any science to back this up?
Actually, yeah, there is. Our source material mentions this scientific study where they had volunteers submerge their heads in cold water.
Yep.
And the researchers found that this cold exposure actually caused a pretty significant spike in their dopamine and norepinephrine levels.
Okay, hold on. For those of us who aren't neuroscientists,
Yeah.
break that down for us. What are those things and why should we care?
Sure. So dopamine, you might have heard it called the feel-good neurotransmitter. It's basically linked to feelings of pleasure, motivation, and that sense of reward. Norepinephrine, on the other hand, is involved in our body's stress response. It kind of ramps up alertness, focus, and energy.
So by dunking their heads in cold water, these volunteers were essentially triggering a release of these powerful brain chemicals.
Exactly.
Wow.
And here's the thing, and this is really key, these elevated levels didn't just disappear right away. They actually stuck around for a while even after the cold exposure was over. So it wasn't just some fleeting rush, there was a lasting effect on their mood and energy.
So it's not just about that initial shock, it's about what comes after, like the afterglow.
Precisely. And this whole thing ties into this idea of our body's hedonic set point, which is basically our baseline level of happiness.
Okay, I'm not familiar with it. Can you explain?
Yeah, sure. Imagine a seesaw, right? On one side, you've got pain, on the other, pleasure. Our bodies naturally try to find a balance between the two. But
Right.
what Michael's experience and this research suggests is that by intentionally exposing ourselves to controlled bursts of pain, we can actually shift that set point, you know?
So it's like we're recalibrating our internal scale.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we're adding weight to the pain side of the seesaw, which makes the pleasure side lift higher, so we become less sensitive to pain and better equipped to actually experience pleasure.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
So is there any other evidence to support this whole pain leading to pleasure thing?
There is, though. It comes from a study that, well, probably wouldn't fly today. Back in the late 1960s, some researchers did this experiment on dogs where they exposed them to repeated electric shocks.
Whoa, okay. Already feeling a little uneasy about this.
Yeah, I get it. Definitely ethically questionable, right?
Yeah.
But the findings are still kind of illuminating in terms of how our brains deal with pain.
Okay.
So initially, the dogs showed all the classic fear and pain responses, right? Whimpering, dilated pupils, racing heart rate. But then, as they kept getting exposed to the shocks, something really interesting happened.
What happened?
their fear and pain actually started to lessen, and eventually their reaction shifted to something that looked a lot like, well, joy.
Wait, joy. From electric shocks. I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that.
I know, it sounds weird, right? But they would wag their tails, lick the researchers' faces, and even seem to slip into this deep state of relaxation.
Wow.
Yeah, it's wild. And the researchers attributed this to this concept called brain homeostasis, which is essentially our brain's incredible ability to adapt and find a new equilibrium, even when it's being bombarded with like repeated discomfort.
So our brains can actually learn to, like, reinterpret pain signals as something positive.
It seems that way. And this leads us to this other concept known as hormesis.
Hormesis. Okay.
Yeah, it's this idea that small controlled doses of stress or discomfort can actually be good for us, like beneficial for our bodies and minds.
So, like, for example, weightlifting, right? How it tears down muscle fibers to make them stronger.
Exactly. Or think about intermittent fasting. You know, by temporarily depriving our bodies of food, we can actually improve our insulin sensitivity and boost cellular repair.
Huh. Interesting. So pushing ourselves outside our comfort zones in a measured way could be the key to unlocking all these benefits.
It's a pretty compelling idea, and one that has some pretty interesting implications for how we approach our physical and mental well-being. But of course, there's a fine line between beneficial discomfort and, like, going too far and causing harm.
Right. We don't want to go overboard and end up doing more harm than good.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. Our source material actually draws this connection between hormesis and the world of extreme sports. Think about someone like Alex Honnold, the guy who free solo climbed El Capitan without ropes. Brain scans showed that his amygdala, the part of the brain that handles fear, was basically silent when he was shown images that would typically freak most people out.
So it's like his brain had adapted to see those dangerous situations as less threatening.
Exactly. And this kind of adaptation can be seen in other contexts, too. Our source mentions this patient named David who used exposure therapy to overcome this, like, crippling social anxiety he had.
Okay.
By repeatedly and gradually putting himself in situations that made him anxious, he was able to actually rewire his brain's response to social interaction.
So both Alex Honnold scaling this sheer rock face and David, like, just ordering coffee in a busy cafe, were both engaging in a form of, like, pain-based training.
Yeah, in a way, yes. They were both intentionally exposing themselves to discomfort to achieve something bigger. Honnold to conquer El Capitan, and David to overcome his social anxiety.
Wow. But this brings up a question, though. Can this pursuit of pain, even when it leads to good things, become, like, addictive?
That's a crucial point, and it's something our sources definitely address. While there's huge potential in using discomfort for growth, it's super important to find a balance.
Otherwise, it could backfire.
Exactly. Our source gives a few cautionary examples. There's the story of an ultramarathon runner who got so hooked on that endorphin rush from running that he ended up pushing his body way too far and getting seriously injured. And then, on a more extreme level, they talk about this patient who developed an addiction to self-harm. The act of inflicting pain gave them this temporary relief from emotional distress, but ultimately trapped them in this destructive cycle.
So it's not just about embracing pain. It's about finding that sweet spot, the right amount of discomfort that leads to positive changes without crossing over into addiction or self-harm.
Right. And this brings us back to Michael. Remember, he's the guy who went all in on cold exposure, even sleeping on a cold water mattress.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that even he realized he needed to moderate things.
Oh, so he didn't stay in the ice bath forever.
Nope. After years of pushing his cold exposure to the max, he eventually dialed it back and found a healthier balance. He started incorporating cold water immersion into his life in a more sustainable way, like as a fun family activity.
So he found a way to make pressing on the pain side part of his routine without letting it take over his life.
Exactly. It's a great example of how we can harness the power of discomfort without falling into its potential traps.
And speaking of potential traps, there's another aspect to this pain-pleasure dynamic that I think is particularly relevant to our listeners, especially those in the Silicon Valley world.
You're talking about workaholism, right? How that drive to achieve and succeed, especially in a high-pressure environment, can sometimes turn into an unhealthy obsession.
Exactly. And this is where this idea of pain addiction takes on a whole new meaning.
Yeah, it does.
And it's something we're going to delve into a lot more after we take a quick break.
Sounds good.
So we're back, and we were just talking about workaholism and how it kind of fits into this whole pain addiction thing. I think it's something a lot of us can relate to, especially in these fast-paced environments we live in, right? Like this constant need to achieve, push harder, do more
Yeah.
all the time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The term workaholism gets thrown around a lot, but there's a real psychological and neurological side to it. It's not just about clocking in long hours. It's about that compulsive drive to work, even when it starts messing with your health, relationships, like your whole well-being.
And I'm guessing this ties back into what we were talking about before with dopamine.
It totally does. See, our brains, they give us this little hit of dopamine when we achieve something, finish a task, or get recognized for our work.
Right.
And in a culture that's obsessed with work, where productivity is like the ultimate virtue, it's easy to get stuck in this dopamine feedback loop.
So the more we work, the more we achieve, the more dopamine we get, and then we just crave that next hit even more.
Exactly. It's like chasing a high, but the substance, the drug, is work itself.
Wow. And our source material actually points out that this work hard, play hard mentality often goes hand in hand with another way of seeking that dopamine rush.
Hmm.
Compulsive overconsumption.
Yeah, it's a fascinating link. You work these crazy long hours, push yourself to the limit, and then what do? You reward yourself with fancy dinners, luxury vacations, maybe a shopping spree.
Right.
It's like you're trying to balance out the pain of overworking with the pleasure of all these material things or these extravagant experiences.
Almost like trying to rebalance that hedonic set point we talked about, but through external means instead of building up internal resilience.
That's a great way to put it. And it creates this vicious cycle. We need to work even harder to afford all these increasingly elaborate rewards, which just fuels the workaholism even more. A classic dopamine trap.
And our source even mentioned that this trap can be particularly strong for people who are already high achievers, those at the top of the income ladder.
It's true. Research shows that higher paid workers are often more likely to put in those long hours compared to their lower paid counterparts.
Interesting.
It's like the stakes get higher, the rewards get juicier, and that drive to achieve becomes even stronger.
Which brings us to this concept of the dopamine economy that our source talked about. Pretty powerful analogy.
It is. Imagine dopamine as a kind of currency in our brains.
Okay, I like that.
Certain activities, like closing a huge deal or hitting a challenging goal, those generate a much bigger payout than, say, just finishing a routine task.
Makes sense.
So for someone who's used to those big dopamine hits, the motivation to keep pushing, keep achieving, keep earning more, it just keeps growing.
It's like a high-stakes game, and the more you win, the harder it is to walk away.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So, okay, we've kind of painted this, kind of bleak picture here. How do we actually break free from this workaholism trap? Especially in a place like Silicon Valley, where the pressure to succeed is so intense.
That's the million-dollar question, right? And honestly, there's no simple answer. But the first step is awareness. Just recognizing the patterns, understanding how dopamine plays a role, and questioning those societal norms that glorify overworking.
So taking a step back and asking ourselves, why am I doing this? And is this actually serving me?
Exactly. It might also help to reframe how we think about success. What if, instead of always striving for more, we focused on finding contentment and fulfillment in what we're doing right now? What if we prioritize the things that truly bring us joy and nourish us, rather than chasing external validation and material rewards?
It's like, maybe we can learn something from Michael and his cold exposure journey. He figured out how to make it part of his life in a balanced and enjoyable way. Maybe we can find that same balance with our work and our ambition.
That's a great point. It's all about finding that sweet spot where we challenge ourselves and pursue our goals without letting the pursuit itself consume us. It's about enjoying the process, not just chasing the outcome.
And remembering that true well-being comes from a more holistic approach to life, one that values not just achievement, but also connection, meaning, and joy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. There's another fascinating aspect to this whole pain-pleasure dynamic that I think we should dive into.
Okay, I'm all ears. What is it?
It's this idea of using pain to actually treat pain. Might sound a bit counterintuitive at first, but it's a concept that's been around for centuries in different forms.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, one of the most well-known is acupuncture, right? That ancient Chinese practice where they insert thin needles into specific points on your body. And while the needles themselves can cause a bit of discomfort, the idea is that they stimulate the release of endorphins, which are your body's natural painkillers.
So you're basically using a controlled, localized pain to try and ease a more widespread or chronic pain condition.
Exactly. And there's actually a good amount of scientific evidence backing up acupuncture. Studies have shown that it can be really effective for things like back pain, migraines, even osteoarthritis.
It's like fighting fire with fire, but in a very carefully controlled and targeted way.
Mm.
I like it.
It's a powerful analogy. And this principle goes beyond just acupuncture. There's more and more research coming out about the potential benefits of using other types of pain to manage pain. For example, there are studies showing that applying a topical capsaicin cream, which creates a burning sensation, can actually reduce pain in conditions like arthritis and neuropathy.
So by intentionally triggering a certain kind of pain response, we can actually change how our body perceives pain overall.
That's the idea, and this concept gets even more, I guess you could say, dramatic when we look at a treatment like electroconvulsive therapy or ECT.
ECT, isn't that the one where they like induce seizures? Sounds pretty intense.
It does sound intense, and it definitely has its controversies, but ECT has actually been shown to be surprisingly effective in treating severe cases of depression and other mental health conditions that haven't responded to other treatments.
So how does it work? What's the thinking behind it?
Well, the exact mechanisms are still not fully understood, but the main theory is that the controlled electrical stimulation of the brain triggers a whole bunch of neurochemical changes. These changes include the release of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, which are super important for mood regulation.
So it's almost like a hard reset for the brain, using this powerful, even if it's a bit jarring, stimulus to jumpstart the healing process.
You could think of it that way. And while ECT is obviously a more extreme example, it does highlight the potential of using strategically applied pain to address these deep-seated issues that haven't responded to anything else.
And I'm sensing a connection back to the idea of hormesis we were discussing earlier.
You got it. Just like exposing our bodies to small doses of physical stress can make us physically stronger and more resilient, it seems like exposing our minds to controlled doses of discomfort could potentially lead to greater emotional and psychological resilience.
So it's about finding that balance between challenge and overwhelm, pushing our boundaries, but also respecting our limits.
Exactly. It's a fascinating and complex topic, and it definitely requires careful consideration and a nuanced approach. But the main takeaway here is that pain, when approached strategically and ethically, can actually be this powerful tool for healing and transformation.
It's a real shift in perspective, and I think it's one that a lot of us could benefit from.
I agree. And on that thought-provoking note, I think it's time we turn the focus to you, our listener. How can you intentionally incorporate these ideas into your own life and experience the benefits of what we've been calling pressing on the pain side?
All right, so let's get practical. We've covered a lot of ground here, from cold showers to extreme sports to like the dopamine economy of Silicon Valley. What does it all actually mean for our listeners? How can they take these insights about pain and pleasure and, actually apply them to their own lives?
Right, that's the key question. It's like if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it really makes us rethink our relationship with comfort and discomfort. I mean, we live in a world that's so obsessed with ease and instant gratification.
Totally.
But what if, by strategically embracing certain types of pain, we could actually become more resilient, more creative, even happier?
Okay, I like the idea in theory, but I need specifics. Give me some actionable takeaways. How can our listeners actually put this into practice?
Well, let's go back to Michael for a second, the ice bath guy. Remember, he initially started with cold exposure to deal with all these intense emotions after getting sober. He gradually pushed his boundaries, but then he found a balance. He dialed back the cold exposure and even made it into this fun thing he could do with his family.
So it's not about, like, everyone jumping into an ice bath tomorrow morning, right? It's more about exploring how small, manageable doses of discomfort could actually be beneficial for us.
Exactly. And those small doses can come in all sorts of forms. Like, think about your own life for a minute. What are some areas where you tend to avoid discomfort? Maybe it's public speaking or trying a new hobby or having those tough conversations we all dread. What if you intentionally leaned into those areas just a little bit at a time?
Okay, I'm picturing myself finally signing up for that improv class I've been putting off for months.
There you go. That's the spirit. It doesn't have to be a huge leap outside your comfort zone right away. Start small. If public speaking freaks you out, try sharing your ideas in a smaller, more supportive setting first. If you've always wanted to learn to paint, sign up for a beginner's class.
It's about building up that tolerance for discomfort,
Yeah.
step by step, just like Michael did with the cold exposure and David did with his social anxiety.
Exactly. And remember that hormesis concept we talked about. Those small doses of stress, whether it's physical or mental, can actually trigger adaptations that make us stronger and more resilient over time.
So maybe instead of always looking for the easiest path, we should be asking ourselves, where can I intentionally challenge myself today?
Love that. It's a great question to keep in mind. And remember, it's not about becoming some kind of masochist or seeking out pain just for the sake of it. It's about recognizing that real growth and transformation often happen when we step outside of what feels comfortable.
It's about finding that sweet spot, that right level of discomfort that pushes us to change for the better without going overboard and self-sabotaging.
Well said. And like with any powerful tool, it's important to use it wisely and with intention. Pay attention to your body, pay attention to your mind, and how they respond to these challenges. Adjust accordingly. If something feels truly overwhelming or like it's doing more harm than good, don't be afraid to back off. And if you find yourself struggling with compulsive behaviors or addiction, whether it's work, exercise, anything, don't hesitate to reach out for help. There's no shame in that.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. I hope it's given our listeners a new way to think about the relationship between pain and pleasure. Discomfort isn't always a bad thing. In fact, it might be the thing you need to reach your full potential.
Absolutely. Embrace the discomfort, push those boundaries, and see what happens. You might be amazed by what you discover.
So next time you find yourself holding back, remember Michael, remember David, even remember those dogs in that ethically questionable experiment. Take a deep breath, step outside that comfort zone, and embrace the power of pressing on the pain side. Until next time.